Stop overpaying on your home loan. We understand that managing your finances can be overwhelming, especially as interest rates continue to rise. With access to 70 plus lenders, our team of specialised brokers will find the best rates for your specific needs. Count on us to secure a lower rate swiftly, giving you the confidence you deserve. Book an appointment with one of our experts today to protect your financial well-being and secure your future. Call us now at 02 8866 2444 or visit our website at finny.com.au.
This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Hello, welcome to a brand new episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. I'm Juliet Helmke, Senior Editor with SPI, bringing you this very special episode with fellow journalist Kyle Robbins, where we discuss some of the recent interesting and perhaps unconventional initiatives and ideas to tackle housing supply. From government programs and investment to new research that might spur a particular sector of development, we say all ideas are welcome, and we are happy to open the conversation here for our listeners to evaluate the merit of solutions to this very tricky issue. Now, as part of this conversation, we looked at how different jurisdictions are reacting to the idea of incentivizing granny flat construction. And at the time of recording the conversation, we were waiting to hear on whether South Australia would move to override council DA approvals and allow citizens to open their ancillary dwellings to private rental. We can report now that that change has gone ahead. And that is one factor we will be keeping an eye on as Adelaide grapples with its own supply issues. Might this free up space in the rental market? We shall see. Thanks for joining us. We've got quite a bit to talk about today, and it all revolves around one word, doesn't it? Supply.
Exactly. It's always supply, Juliet. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. Obviously, we're a man down for the listeners, but we're going to make do with what we've got.
Yes, we're soldiering on without our fearless leader, Grace Ormsby, who will be back helming the podcast in no time. But for today, you've got the two of us, and we'll be discussing some stories that we have recently been writing about, as I mentioned, all about that word supply. So our first one today covers some independent research that could be small, yet still a significant piece of the puzzle for solving the country's supply woes. After that, we'll be jumping onto some recent and honestly, in some ways, a bit controversial moves that states and territories have been making to free up land and to incentivize building. But first, Kyle, let's jump onto the issue of granny flats, or ancillary dwellings, as they're called in more professional speak. But we've recently heard this week, so we've got some new research out from CoreLogic. They worked with the planning research platform Orchestra and the real estate construction lender Blackfoot to really get a full picture of the untapped potential for building granny flats across Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Now, they've done this because obviously at the moment, housing supply faces a number of challenges, and one of those is finding available land for building and encouraging higher density development because it can take a while to bring onto the market. The other one, of course, is when you're trying to encourage density is getting around or really working with the communities, the councils to bring that in, which can, in a lot of cases, change things for neighborhoods. And we get a lot of backlash against that when you see that coming in. So the idea of identifying spaces where granny flats could be built and rented out, potentially to people who are needing to find homes. It could be family members, or it could, depending on the laws in the jurisdiction, could even be any member of the public. They're saying this could really be a way to bring some supply into the market without some of the headaches and pains that we face in trying to increase density. So, Kyle, do you want to give us a little sort of overview of what they found across those three cities, of the potential for it?
For sure. So as we know, I think supply has been a big issue at the moment across Australian property, and it looks like it'll be like that for the near-term future. I think we don't have enough houses, and we are sort of not running out of land. We have a lot of it, but we're running out of habitable land, and so it's always looking for innovation. And CoreLogic have crunched the numbers, and depending on what capital city you're in, you're more or less likely to be conducive to increased granny flats. So Sydney, they've said, has 242,000 properties that would be suitable to accommodating a new 2-bedroom self-contained dwelling, just a fancy way to say granny flat, or about 17% of the capital city's housing stock. In Brisbane, that number drops to 185,000%, but the actual overall portion of housing stock increases to 23%. So that's nearly a quarter of Brisbane's housing stock that, you could put another 2-bedroom home. And I think at a time, I wrote this week about how the rental crisis is continuing in this country. Even the cost of living crisis, if you're a family of 4 in the outer suburbs of Brisbane or Sydney and you've got, a bit of land at the back of your property that's sort of getting unfulfilled or unused, and you have the capacity to throw a 2-bedroom granny flat or even like a single bedroom granny flat on there, not only is that extra income from yourself in terms of a rent per week, obviously there's the outlay to build it, but you're going to make a bit of rent in a cost of living crunch. Every penny's worth, 1,000. And then in terms of the rental crisis, which has been, just one of the great, great's probably not the right word, but it's just been one of the big stories of the last 18 months. We don't have enough rental supply. People are lining up out the door, at least in Sydney. They're lining up for 30 minutes just to inspect a property. So I think if you can have an alternative option in the form of a granny flat that they're still fantastic dwellings, you're still able to live out of them, even if it's a temporary fix. I don't think there's anything that can go wrong with it in terms of just increasing supply and whatnot.
Absolutely. And, it's exactly that. Nobody's saying this is a silver bullet. It's not like the country's housing problems are going to be solved by granny flats by any stretch of the imagination. But what they are saying is they could potentially loosen things up a little bit.
Be a little stopgap solution.
Exactly. And, in Melbourne, we've seen, as per the research, they've got almost 230,000 potential sites that they identify, and that's about 13% of the city's stock. In that area, though, it should be noted that Victorian law actually prohibits the renting of granny flats or ancillary dwellings to anyone other than a dependent of the primary resident. So that means, you can't lob it onto the rental market. It's got to be somebody who's dependent on you, a family member, somebody who's related to you. And at the same time, it can only be inhabited by one person legally. So they've got, some laws around it. So it's not like putting a bunch of granny flats. It's just like
opening the floodgates. Exactly.
Open market for anybody who wants to rent it, at least in Victoria. But they are saying even there, that could be something. Because these are often used not as potentially like long-term homes that people stay in, but that little bit of a stopgap. Say, for example, you're thinking about moving out, you want to get out of mum and dad's place, but you're having trouble finding a rental. Like the granny flat is a really great spot to potentially be able to have that independence. You live there for a couple years, maybe you even, probably mum and dad are charging you pretty nice rent, if they're charging you rent. And it gives you some little time to save up. Maybe you're even going from that to the housing market. Maybe that's the way to leverage into that in itself. So it kind of creates this little bit of space in rentals that they're saying, at this point in time, why overlook anything? Right.
And on the flip side of that as well, you could probably have, for example, like a single grandparent. We've always talked about downsizing and having people who, they're living in a house that's far too big for them, the upkeep and the maintenance. So if you could have a single grandparent move into a granny flat out the back of a property, that frees up a home for a family that otherwise would probably struggle to find a home in a certain desirable area.
Definitely. It increases the housing options too by having that sort of smaller type dwelling. The other people who they're saying this could potentially help, because the sites that the firms identified across these 3 cities, more than a third of them were within 2 kilometers of a train or light rail station, which is great, really well placed for commuters, potentially people who don't have cars, who are, trying to get in and out of the city. Furthermore, 17% actually have a hospital within the suburb boundary, which is great news for serving essential workers, particularly in the instance where you're young, you're getting experience, you're not necessarily putting down really solid roots. You want to stay in this community forever, but you need to live near where you work, and you might be at a hospital for a year when you're starting out, when you're doing your training, that kind of thing. So they're also saying this could really be, potentially beneficial for the healthcare sector, for those sort of essential workers, which, as we've heard, is becoming more and more of an issue. People, particularly in healthcare, being unable to live close enough to where they work because housing prices, particularly in the middle of the city, the cost of living is just astronomical.
Of course, yeah. I do think it's just it's a bit of like creative math in accounting, you know what I mean? You've just got to sort of find an alternative solution to the current problem. And I think, the granny flats, and whether or not we see a mass influx of granny flats into Australian backyards, remains to be seen. But just the fact that these kind of ideas are out there and populating the market, I think is a good sign in terms of fixing or not even fixing, but providing an alternative to the current issues.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And, Tim Lawless over at CoreLogic has said this is really something that governments need to be looking at, considering how they kind of use this as part of their arsenal for housing supply. And it's something that we know is kind of happening. Now, look, all of the states and territories have sort of different rules around them. As we mentioned, Victoria's are sort of like quite tight in who you can rent to. Obviously, councils have different rules too in terms of what you can build and where. Something interesting that we are keeping an eye on at REB are the laws around granny flats in South Australia. Now, we know that about 2 weeks ago, Planning Commissioner received a letter from that state's sort of minister in charge of housing and planning saying we need to look at what councils are doing around granny flats, which is prohibiting them being rented out. So the state itself doesn't actually have a law around whether you can't rent out granny flats, but a lot of councils have been putting this within their DA, within any, approvals for building a granny flat, saying, okay, you can build this granny flat, but you're not allowed to rent it out to anybody other than, a family member. South Australia has considered changing their planning guidelines to sort of override that. Now, we know there was a meeting where they discussed it. They haven't really come out and said what the go was out of that. So we're keeping an eye on it, and we will bring it to you first as soon as we know. We are going to be taking a short break now. We'll be back on the other side to talk more about the current strategies to boost supply.
Are you stressed out not knowing where to find distressed, off-market, high cash flow properties in high-growth areas? What about the best strategy to build a wealth-generating portfolio? Look no further. Dragan Domovsky of Buyers Agency Australia can help. With over 20 years of experience as a property investor, Dragan is a qualified property investment advisor and expert buyer's agent, so he knows how to find the best deals and negotiate for his clients. Right now, he's offering a free 45-minute strategy session to get you started, normally worth $500. Text the code BAA along with your name and email address to 0405 105074. That's 0405 105074. And take advantage of this offer. Take control of your financial future today.
Welcome back. I'm joined by Kyle Robbins, where we are doing a bit of an editorial update, focusing in on supply and the unconventional ways that states are looking at boosting supply that, private researchers have come around and said here could be a potential. And we were talking about granny flats, Kyle, before the break, and some of the rules that states have around that. Now, we've seen states changing their rules sort of across the board to address this supply issue. And one of the ways in which that's happened recently is in Victoria, where they have decided to kind of expand this tax that they have on vacant properties. Now, prior to, about 2 weeks ago, we heard a proposal from the Victorian government to expand that vacant property tax. So to make sure that it applies now to the entire state, any vacant residential dwelling will start to be taxed. In addition, they're also looking at vacant land, so land that doesn't have anything sitting on it. They call it undeveloped land, and that used to be exempt. But now they're looking at it and they're saying, if it's sitting within those important Melbourne rings, we're going to start taxing that as well. So that's a proposal that they are looking at, and it has really ruffled some feathers, hasn't it, Kyle? There are a lot of different opinions coming out about this.
Yeah, I think of all the articles we posted in the last month or so, I think this one was one of the most commented on ones. We should specify that the undeveloped residential land will only be become taxed after 5 years.
That's true.
And vacant or unoccupied properties are 6 months. So we should say that it's not as if you're going to have a vacant land there for 1 month and start getting taxed. There is obviously some reasonable guidelines to it. But yeah, as you've said, this is probably one of the most spoken about topics that we've had certainly in the last month. It's just one of those things where it's almost a win-win for government, as we've discussed here in the office a bit. Either people don't want to pay the tax and they do something with their undeveloped land, they build a house on it and they put that house on the market or they rent it out. Or in a similar vein, their unoccupied property, they sell it or they put it on the rental market, and that spurs a bit of housing supply down in Victoria, which, like everywhere else, needs it. Or people pay the tax and the government makes more money. It's honestly like one of the great win-wins for the Victorian government, and people aren't happy about it. But at the end of the day, like we said before with granny flats, and that has been a similar theme on our podcast channel and websites last year, we just need more supply. We don't have enough houses. You get a number of reports every couple of months talking about how much of a housing shortfall we have. I think I've read that it's up to nearly 170,000 houses that we need in the next 5 years, and they're not just got to come out of thin air. I think governments and policymakers and even developers and stuff need to start looking at a bit of a alternative route into inspiring some more houses and rental properties on the market, and this is just another example of it.
Yeah, and we should sort of talk about the thing that people primarily object to, and that's they're saying the more sort of taxes and rules that you impose on investment in a place, the more that people start to get a little bit scared of being able to navigate them and potentially pull out of the market. In this case, Victoria is basically saying, well, if you're disincentivizing the investors who aren't going to leverage these properties on the long-term market anyway, then kind of like that's fine if we lose them. They're not scared about losing those people. We have heard some of the institutes, some of the advocates for investors who are saying, well, but you don't want to make the system so cumbersome that it scares everybody away. And it seems like that's a risk that the government is willing to take. They're sort of saying like, that's not enough for us to feel like this isn't worthwhile, because in all the other scenarios, if people sell their vacant properties, it's going to be bought by someone who either needs a primary home or somebody who is going to leverage it on the market. If people decide to pay the tax, then we've got money that we can put into other housing initiatives. Or if they go, oh, you know what, I've got that property sitting vacant, I guess I'll rent it out. All of those, they're like, we win. We want this to happen. So that's kind of the perspective that they've been taking on it. It's interesting. It's interesting to see. The state's treasurer, Tim Pallas, said the tax, he put it plainly. This is about supply. He said it's all about freeing up empty houses for rent and vacant land for new homes, particularly across the outer suburbs and regional Victoria. We know the best thing you can do to make homes more affordable is supply more of them. And so that's what they feel they're doing. So some interesting changes coming down there.
Yeah, I'm sure there's more to come on this. I'm sure we'll see a bit more in the coming months.
Absolutely, and we will bring you those updates as we have them. More on what other areas in the country are doing to tackle the supply problem after a quick ad break. Welcome back. We are talking unusual and interesting and unconventional ways of tackling supply across the country. The latest thing we've seen is the Northern Territory. Now, they haven't necessarily come out with a new policy or a new program, but what they are saying is basically they want to position themselves as the best place in the country to build or buy a home. They're saying, like, we've got the space, property is more affordable to buy here. Come on, we want people to be coming on up and living in the Northern Territory because we've got the housing for you. And so the way that they've sort of decided to push that message and identify ways of incentivizing that is by establishing this Northern Territory Housing Alliance. The alliance is going to report directly to the Northern Territory's Chief Minister, Natasha Files, and Alan McGill has been named chair of the alliance. Further board members are going to be announced at a later date, but Mr. McGill is also the current chair of Venture Housing and holds roles within the Northern Territory's Planning Commission and Heritage Council. So really interesting to see that happening, Kyle. Interesting to see the government sort of putting across this new body to put their housing initiatives forward.
Yeah, it's very bold. I mean, the statement to make them, the leader for housing in Australia essentially is pretty bold. I mean, I'm going to quote Miss Files directly here when she says, "The great Australian dream might be unachievable everywhere else in the country, but in the Territory, we are going to make sure more people can achieve it. The Territory is the place to build your future." So it's very clear what her position is and what the position of her government and what the position of the board will be. And I think we have seen a lot of interstate migration in the last couple of years. I think a lot of it is, the biggest trend line is Sydney and Melbourne to Brisbane, and affordability and lifestyle are two of the main draw cards there. Darwin, it probably does have the affordability card. The lifestyle card, the weather is probably a little bit warmer for a lot longer up there. So I think if they can sort of get the strategy right, they might be able to achieve this dream. I think it's a great idea. It's bold. It's, like we said, it's an unconventional way of trying to increase housing supply. But good luck to them, I'd say.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting to see them tap into that. We're always hearing about the concept of the Australian dream, and really it's to buy a house, to be able to live in the property that you own. And we're hearing about it a lot, as that seems to be, as people are always saying, is it getting farther and farther out of reach, particularly for first home buyers, for the young people coming up. And so to hear an entire territory say, we're going to bill ourselves as the place where you can still achieve that dream. Like it taps into the Australian psyche. I think it's really a bit of an emotional pull, and it's an interesting tactic. So we'll be watching to see how that plays out. And we just say, the more that states and territories are doing to incentivize building, to position themselves as having an offering for people who are needing a home, good on them, and we'll be interested to see how this grows and what the alliance does.
As they say, imperfect action is better than perfect inaction. So, the more the merrier, I say.
They sure do, that's for sure. So some really interesting ways we've seen the country responding to this supply crisis. I know that we will be seeing more of it because it is something that we are grappling with every single day. We will continue to bring you those updates. And that's about all we have time for on this episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. Listeners, if you liked this episode, be sure to like or review us on whatever platform you listen to podcasts on. Stay up to date with all the latest news over at smartpropertyinvestment.com.au and follow us on our socials, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. If you have any questions or want to put forward someone who you think would make a great guest on a future episode of the Smart Property Investment Show, send us an email, editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Until next time, stay well.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property, or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Do you need help planning your next event? With over 15 years of experience, Captivate Events is the expert in event planning. Our dedicated team ensures every detail is meticulously handled. Whether it's a gala dinner, exhibition, conference, or study tour, we've got you covered. We'll be there every step of the way, from conceptualisation to flawless execution, to ensure your event is a seamless experience, minimising the time and stress involved in planning. Make your next event one to remember. Visit www.captivateevents.com.au or call 02 88 66 2440 and find out how we can captivate your audience.